Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for another one of Ironside's Take 30 with the data scientist. I'm Pam Askar. I'm the Director of Data Science at Ironside. I've been doing data science in consulting for nearly 10 years and used machine learning for academic research prior to that for a while. I'm joined today by Paul Hardy, and I'll give him a second to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Paul Hardy. I run our advisory services practice here at Ironside, which focuses on all things data strategy related. And I've been working in strategy and technology consulting for most of my 30-year career. Thanks, Pam.
Great. Thanks. It's great to have Paul with me today. We team up very frequently to work together on strategy engagements where our clients are looking to build out their long-term plan towards AI maturity. That always starts, of course, with the use cases. And so that's what we're here to talk about, is our approach and methodology to helping organizations define those use cases to kick them off in their journey towards AI maturity. So today, we'll talk about that process, how to define an AI use case, why that's so important, and how to build that catalog for yourself. Also on the slide here, you'll see for next week, just reminders about upcoming topics. So next week, I'll be joined by our partner, Pitney Bowes, to talk about data enrichment. So we always like to start with a reminder of our mission at Ironside. That's to help our clients use data to make better decisions about their business. And we do that with our 20+ years of end-to-end data and analytics experience across the entire lifespan, literally end-to-end data analytics, AI. We have capabilities to support and step in. So today we'll be talking about that advise wedge of the wheel, but AI is one of those practices that really goes across every one of these capabilities. We help to design, build, deploy, govern, and manage AI assets. But we also have experience in these same capabilities across billing, visualizations, warehouses, etc.
Well, again, welcome everybody. We appreciate your attending. And of course, the question is, why are we here discussing AI use cases? And this is someone everyone will recognize, of course, Elon Musk, and you can read his quote. And it's stated in a very Elon Musky way, which is always fun. But the real point it's making is that AI is becoming a competitive imperative, right? And I think everyone sees that. You can get a quote like this from any number of other leaders out there in the world. So that's why we're here, is to understand how we can be more competitive with AI. And in fact, before we're beaten up by our competitors, as Elon would say. So back to this polling. Here's what we know is that leaders are adopting AI for competitive advantage. Let's talk about what a leader is. Here is a poll this is from O'Reilly. You can see at the bottom, 1,300 respondents. This is from 2019, so reasonably recent. And what you see here is they've simply asked, how would each organization rate themselves in terms of their maturity in AI? So the good news is that it looks like, if you look at those bottom two rungs, 73% of respondents are still in the early stages of AI adoption, right? So only 27% believe they're actually mature in AI as of 2019, which is frankly a higher number than I would have guessed. But the good news is that the train has not left the station. However, if you look at the investment, what you see here on the right-hand side is those three stages of maturity again, either mature, evaluation stage, or not yet using. And this is indicating how much they're planning to invest in AI. And if you look at this blue stripe for the mature practice, what you see is that the level of investment they are making is massive going forward. So they've been delving into AI for competitive advantage. They found that it has really worked. And so those early leaders are accelerating their investments and their competitive advantage. So, well, certainly everybody can think about where they fit on that level. But again, the important takeaway here is that for those that are already on the train and the train is leaving the station, they are, the pace is accelerating. So that means all of us need to get on board. So for the organizations that are not yet mature, what are the barriers they're experiencing to AI adoption? So this is again from O'Reilly, the same study. And what you see here, I'll give you a second to look at those results on the left-hand side. This is also the poll that you took. But what you see first and foremost is company culture is what is preventing people from adopting AI. Now, for those of us that are gray-haired and been around in the industry for a long time, any industry, this makes perfect sense, right? We've all been through large amounts of change in the years, over the years. And what we know is that culture is at the core of change management. And the adoption of AI and other forms of automation is clearly going to be a major change in all enterprises today, in all industries. And so the need for cultural change at the heart of change management is understood. And in fact, I applaud O'Reilly for making this a possible response, and the respondents for identifying it as the top choice, because cultural change is always a challenge. If you look at the next three, what you'll see is that they're all very logical. They're about the same weighting, 19, 18, 17, and they're very logical responses. So the first one, lack of data or data quality issues. That makes sense. This is AI, it's about data, right? So that certainly would be a logical response. Lack of skilled people also makes a great deal of sense. This is becoming a very popular topic, obviously. These people are in high demand and therefore are reasonably expensive. A particular problem for mid-tier companies because they're not mature typically, and therefore creating an attractive proposition for a data scientist to work is challenging for them. And Pam will talk particularly, I think in about 2 weeks, about ways around that particular challenge, but clearly a logical challenge as well, lack of skilled people. Third, difficulty identifying use cases. So now we've arrived at the heart of the matter for us. Again, very logical. If organizations don't understand how to apply AI to a use case, well, then that's certainly going to be a barrier to them adopting it. But here's the question to us. Culture, again at the top, why is culture so challenging when it comes to AI? And we believe that that is directly related to that fourth item, difficulty identifying use cases. It makes sense if people could identify a use for AI, or more importantly, identify business value generated by the use of AI, then that would drive cultural change. We know every culture is, focused in part on measurement. If you have measurements and those measurements are generating business results, then that's going to help drive that cultural change. And further, we think that fourth item is directly related to the second item, lack of data or data quality issues. We believe that both business value and data value have to be entertained simultaneously. But the challenge with the lack of data quality issues is, unfortunately, that's where many organizations go. They don't start down at item 4 looking at the use cases. They start rather with item 2. They look first at their data, and that can lead you on a slippery slope into a lot of excess work that is unfocused. So we believe that for AI use cases, the business value and the data value are both closely linked. You have to go after both of those issues that we see on this list. But they must be business value led. And we would further submit that if you manage those use cases and the associated data, that you will drive that cultural change based on the success that you create. So the good news is that opportunities exist across the entire enterprise. This is that same survey. And what you see here is very interesting. You see a list of all of the places that respondents that are using AI are and have in fact employed them by functional area or department or organization. First, you see research and development, not a shock. A lot of research and development is actually done or predicated on using AI. But below that, you see every other sort of operational function within any enterprise. And further, you should notice that what you see there is a mix of both customer-facing activities like customer service, sales, or marketing, advertising, PR, as well as operational functions that might be more focused on cost rather than revenue generation. So clearly, people are applying AI all across the enterprise. So you might ask then, with all of those challenges that we just saw, how is it possible that they can do all of this? And the answer is that any function with historical data, sufficient historical data, has the opportunity to employ AI. It doesn't mean it's going to work every time, but what you can see here is that AI does work in some ways across every part of the organization, and any organization that therefore has a sufficient quantity of decent data, they have at least the opportunity to develop a use case in one of those functions. And that's actually an exciting proposition for the new entrants to be able to become mature entities in AI. And we will further say that you should build a catalog of these types of opportunities. That it's not about finding the one that's on this list or the one that is so obvious to you when you first started thinking about AI, particularly as someone who's not one of those mature organizations already. You should build the mindset from the start that says, There are lots of AI opportunities across the organization, as this chart indicates. And what we're going to do is build a catalog of those. We're going to analyze and prioritize that catalog. As we'll talk about later, that will help in cultural change and in mitigating the risk you have of putting all your eggs in one basket. And further, there are ways to accomplish the building of this catalog that will positively drive that cultural change. And we'll talk about the way that we do that, and hopefully that will demonstrate that cultural push as well. So let's talk about use cases then in AI in general. What is an AI use case? So very simple bullet points. It addresses an important business question. That's a great thing. We certainly hope it would, but is more granular. So that great business question you want to address, I want to grow revenue or reduce cost, it's a little bit too high level. You want to get there and see results in those measurements, but what you have to do is break it down to something more granular that helps drive those things. We'll talk a lot about drivers. An AI use case predicts and prescribes future actions rather than describing past outcomes. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, I believe it's a Gartner model about descriptive, diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive, types of analytics. AI typically is focused on using data of the past to predict something in the future, and prescribing it further means that it can dictate behaviors that you should take consistent with those predictions that you have made. So you want to be predictive and prescriptive in AI and solve a business problem that involves those parameters. Okay, and the implementation generates business value. Full stop. This is not an exercise in data management or what's interesting in my data. It's an exercise in creating business value, and that is measured quantitatively as you would in any other project in the history of your organizations. Within your organization, you probably have a business case form or a capital investment form that you need to put in place in order to get investment dollars. It's the same thing here, and you should treat it with that same level of discipline as we do. So we develop business cases associated with typical discounted cash flow outcomes, return on investment, net present value, that sort of thing. You may use break-even analysis, whatever works in your organization. Use that model and apply it to your AI business cases as well. And importantly, this last point, you may be reliant upon understanding more than a few drivers. So the idea is there's complexity. Back to that granularity, there's complexity, and that's where the art and the science come into this. So that's what an AI use case is. What's a good AI use case? Well, it has that business value that we've described above, but it also has, of course, sufficient, clean historical data and data that generates signal. And Pam's going to talk in more detail about those data components in just a moment. And importantly, what you see there in bold is it also, a good AI business case also generates the right champion or the right internal support. Back to that issue of cultural change that O'Reilly found. If we don't plan our business use cases in a way that can demonstrate value and develop champions for that value, then we're going to be less likely to be able to fulfill, the catalog of ideas that we come up with. So very important as an all change management to focus on not just the quantitative business value, but call it the quantitative one associated with internal support and champions. So we were going to talk about a couple of examples of that. Pam, I know you wanted to jump in with one first. Why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, I have an example. I also wanted to just point out that if questions arise that you have throughout the talk that we're giving, feel free to write them in the chat box. And at the end, we're going to save some time for Q&A, so we'll have them there. So feel free to do that. So the example that I was going to give here is from a client who is a utility company. So if you think about if you want to dig a hole in your property, right, you dial 411 or 811 to get some permission to dig that, and they're going to assess the risk and say, okay, that seems safe. If it's high risk, what they're going to do is send one of their resources to be on site to manage and reduce the risk. Now, those resources are kind of expensive. So their overarching business goal was to optimize those resources, make sure that they send them when it's high risk so that they can mitigate that risk, and don't send them where they don't need them if you're installing a mailbox post, right? Because they're expensive resources. So they want to optimize that. But that is a business goal, right? And that often gets confused with an AI use case. The AI use case is more tactical. In this case, it's predict the likelihood that damage is going to happen at any given site based on all the information that comes in about that call. And so that addresses that overarching business goal. It brings value by lowering costs of damage, lowering costs of resources that could have been used elsewhere. It's predicting likelihood of damage, it's prescribing action. Send somebody to this site, for example. And it's relying on understanding more than a couple drivers, right? You could look at square foot of the area where the dig's going to happen. You could look at experience of the excavator, but the reality is it's more complicated and there's a lot of factors that go in, and you have the ability to automate that process. So that's the example I had.
Great, thanks, Pam. I'm going to actually save my example for the next slide, but what I like about that example, Pam, is that it is one that is focused on internal operations, again, indicating there are lots of different places to apply AI use cases in an organization. I'm going to talk about one that's actually market facing. So I'll talk about that in this context. What are the steps to creating this business use case? First, the business analysis side of the equation. Phase one of that is we got to discover the use cases. We do that, not surprisingly, through functional interviews. So, and it's a logical sequence: start high, dig down low to that granularity. What are the company's strategic goals? How is the organization's success measured when we're talking to one of these functional leaders? Are you driven by cost, by reducing cost, by growing revenue, by managing risk? Are you focused on more specific operational drivers around speed or resource use or something of that nature, which lead to typically either revenue or cost outcomes? What are your greatest challenges and pain points at achieving those? And what information then do you wish you had? What would you like to be able to predict as you get frustrated in trying to achieve your outcomes? What things would you like to be able to predict, right? And then what are the drivers of your improved measures? So again, you've started with those high-level measures, and now you've broken that down a bit. As Pam used in her example, it was, we want to be able to deploy resources more efficiently, but we've got to understand equipment usage and other things that drive that. That's what we call business decomposition. It's how do you start with an objective and break it down step by step into a set of things that become data elements that exist in your organization. And what is a valuable target metric? So that is that final granular metric that Pam will talk about in a minute. And then lastly, back, not forgetting our cultural change, what executive would love the answer? Okay, so if we could solve that problem, if we could predict that thing for that executive and impact that highest level measurement, even though today they might not be thinking about that low level measurement that is in our data set, who would be a champion for that? And I'm going to use an example right now. So this is an executive search firm. It happens to be an executive search firm that is focused in the education space. And their objective, not surprisingly, was to grow revenue. Right? We would all like that. How would like to do that? Now we start with the decomposition. They want to win more search competitions, so they're competing against other firms to get those search contracts. So how do you do that? Well, we need to prove that we can find the best candidate. Okay, that's also not a surprise. But what is next as you dig down, best is not who meets the job description. That, in fact, is today, even using AI, natural language processing, that is a very common use case in the industry overall of executive search, where language in an applicant's resume is matched to language in a job description. But that doesn't really determine who is best. Who is best in this industry is something that this organization knows. And it's dictated by these more granular measures, right? Who was actually hired into one of these types of roles? How many years were they in these executive roles in education? Did they move to an upscale position or an upscale institution from the one that they were in for a period of time? And did they do that by specific, in this case, school category, universities, high schools, private schools, parochial schools, different tiers of those private institutions? Okay, that is the granularity that they were able to dig down into. Why? Because they had 10 years of data to prove the correlation of those drivers to successful outcomes, right? And they could use that to score candidates. So that's the prescriptive side of things. They would predict who was best, and the prescriptive side was to take action by indicating which candidates, and by the way, these aren't necessarily applicants, these are candidates in place in the market today. Who can they reach out to who is best qualified for these roles? They can prove they can do that, find the best, do it faster using automation, huge business value all the way back up that chain to growing revenue. So that's one example. Second phase of business analysis is building the business case. I won't go into that in too much detail because I already spoke to it, but what you've got to do, of course, is identify those drivers, take the baseline of what their metrics are today in cost and resource, make some predictions about what they will be in the future, and do sensitivity analysis around what the art of the possible might be if your business decomposition exercise is correct. All right, Pam, I'm going to hand this back to you then to talk about the other side of this, the data analysis side.
Yeah, so as you go through all those steps that Paul just talked about and ask all those questions about the business, you're coming up with the business value of those use cases. The flip side of that is balancing it with feasibility in the data, right? Will the data support those use cases? And so what we do is ask a bunch of questions, just like we did with the business, but these need to be answered by the data themselves. So we profile the data and score it on a number of dimensions. Things like data volume, data aptitude, the quality, and the access. A few points about some of these, because I think they're commonly misunderstood. For one, data volume, people will underestimate how much data they really need. They'll say, well, we don't really have big data, so we can't do AI. I come from academic research. If I had 100 data points, I was thrilled, right? So you'd be surprised what we can do with small data. On the flip side of that, an organization will say, we have big data, we have massive amounts of data. We should be able to answer all these questions. And you can't always because of the other dimensions there. And so data volume is one of the dimensions, but it's not an easy answer like, well, we need X terabytes of data, right? Can't always be answered that way. Part of the reason is that it's not always so much when you ask how much data do you need, it's not necessarily volume this way, it's also how much data do you have. So that gets more into the aptitude. Do you have the answers to these questions? Do you have all the fields and attributes and drivers? So when Paul mentioned drivers before, and that's one of the questions that we ask, does your data set actually answer the questions that you need for that use case? So let me give an example. We worked with a relocation management firm, and we went through all the steps that Paul just talked about. We interviewed the company, we interviewed their clients, and one of the most common questions that came up is, I need to know if relocating someone is going to be beneficial. Will it be successful? So if I pick up an employee from Boston and relocate them to Shanghai, is it going to be successful? So determining success is kind of challenging, but let's just say it means they finished their job there. They were assigned for 2 years and they finished it. One of the steps that we take to measure this and determine if you have what you need in your data set is to say, let's forget about the data for a minute and just think about success and relocation. What are all the things that could impact that, right? Let's just brainstorm. Let's get the subject matter experts in the room and let's all think about what those drivers could be. So if you think about it, things like, are you picking up a family and relocating them? Do you know the language? Have you visited that country before? Are you 25 years old and don't have a family to drag along and, you're adventurous, right? So there's all these things that could impact it. That use case was actually not successful and we didn't go forward with it because none of that actually sits in the relocation management company's data set, right? It might with the individual clients, but not in theirs. If it came down to, they lost our household goods shipment or our visa was delayed, that is contained because the relocation management manages all of that. And so that's just an example where we have a great question. It has huge business value if you could address that, right? And we have tons of data, but we just don't have the drivers sitting in that data set that could answer that question. So that's what I mean about not necessarily looking for volume, but looking for, is this data set appropriate for it, right? Do you have all the answers in there? And the other piece about aptitude is not just do you have the drivers and the attributes, do you have the target? Is the target actually labeled? So if we think about that same example, success, is that labeled in there? Do you have a column that says this was successful? No, that's another reason that we didn't go forward with it is because that's so hard to define, right? Is it they stayed with the company? Is it that they finished their mission and came home? What does that mean? And so sometimes you have to think about it would be great to predict X, like customer churn. What does customer churn mean? How do we define that? Does that mean they haven't bought from us in a year, in a month? Does that mean they canceled the subscription? How do you actually define churn? And then is that captured in your data set somewhere? Do we have enough variability if we're looking at price sensitivity? Have we offered a significant price range to be able to find signal in there? And so data aptitude is one of the hardest things to just speak to and quickly measure, but it's one of the most important. Then we get down to data quality. Everyone knows you need to have clean data. Again, sometimes clients underestimate their data and think, well, it's a mess, there's problems in it. There might be more value there than you think, and so that's something that we can go in and look at. It needs to be trustworthy as well as complete. and data access. So oftentimes the data's there, but it might be in a number of dispersed systems that all have different owners that have competing interests. And so the use case might be great, the data might be great, and the data might be there, but it might not be something that you prioritize if there's significant effort to collect and bring it all to the same place. So, and yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay, thanks, Pam.
You're good.
Thank you for that. Great. So now we've talked about the business analysis dimension and the data analysis dimension of business use cases. And here's where those two things come together. This is what we call a use case validation and prioritization workshop, and it has many positive benefits. Of course, it brings those two dimensions together. On the left-hand side, you see the data viability that Pam was discussing. On the bottom, the business viability I was discussing. You see indications under each of those of the types of scoring that can be brought to bear for each use case that has been hypothesized, that came out of all of those interviews that were done as you're developing that catalog. And what this allows you to do, this framework, is to begin to prioritize those. So how do you do this? You do it in a workshop. You engage all those key business and technical stakeholders from the interviews that you had. You use the stakeholders to validate the analyses. They've spoken to you. They always wonder, in our experience, what became of that conversation I had with the consulting firm, or with my own business analysts? What was the outcome? So you involve the stakeholders, you validate the analyses on each of these axes separately, you bring them together, and you engage those stakeholders in doing this prioritization exercise. That allows them to generate ownership and creates that cultural change. And we build a catalog of these because it will diversify our risk. Pam just gave you an example of a use case that didn't end up being viable in the relocation client example that we mentioned. So you diversify that risk and you generate a roadmap. And culturally, when people can see that set of opportunities coming down the road, then AI becomes a more understandable, useful tool. You're not placing all your bets on where there was this one thing we thought we could do and wanted to do, because maybe our data, we have good data on it, right? It wasn't business case led. So, and in this framework, some interesting points. Upper right-hand side, of course, those are going to be the priorities: high business value, high data viability. Lower left side, neither. So let's remove those. But the other two corners have some interesting outcomes. So Pam, I'm going to let you talk about those quickly.
Yeah, just the value traps. This is a common issue where people say, here's the data that we have. What problems can we solve with this data, right? It's all available. It's good quality there. The problem is you might be spending effort to solve a problem that you give back to the business and they say, that's great, but that's not really the problem that I was concerned with. On the other side, the data remediation, these are great to put on the backlog and start addressing. So we've had this happen before. We say, you know, we go through this whole process and say, these are great use cases. They have a lot of business value, but the data's not there yet. If you make this change or this change in your governance or data collection, you know, give it 6 months, a year, you may be ready to act on this. And we've had that happen. We've had very agile organizations say, okay, let's work on that. In the meantime, we go forward with other AI use cases. A year later, we're ready to come back to this because they've addressed that data.
Thank you, Pam. I know we're running long, so I think maybe you're going to talk about this one or something like it in about 2 weeks. Should we just move on to our conclusions?
Yeah, let's do that.
Great, great. I guess all I'll say about those steps is that at this point, you've identified your catalog of use cases, and you have many steps to go through to turn those into actual AI applications. So Pam will talk about that more 2 weeks from today. So what are the conclusions? You know, use cases are granular. You start with big business problems you want to solve. They address big business goals, but they do create, they're granular and they create quantitative value. And don't start with the data. That is a big issue, that people tend to want to start with data because AI is intrinsically a data-driven exercise. Okay, use cases should be value-led, business value-led first. However, any business with sufficient historical data has the opportunity to employ AI. So don't be discouraged. There are opportunities there in every function, as we saw. Build a catalog, right? Diversify your risk, put a roadmap in place, and recognize that's a catalog of value. They wouldn't be in the catalog, the use cases, if they hadn't passed muster with respect to generating business value. So it's not a catalog for catalog's sake. And drive cultural change by engaging stakeholders and finding champions. Do it in a process in which you start with their stakeholders, you understand their demands, and then you keep them and their ideas, but you keep them engaged in the process throughout, generate that ownership, and find a champion so that your initial cases create that cultural change throughout. And lastly, given where we are today with the shutdown across the country we're all experiencing. I hope everyone listening is handling that as well as you possibly can. Our thought, and it's true with a couple of clients that we're working with right now, is this is an ideal time to do this. It's an ideal time when your stakeholders are sitting in their respective homes in all likelihood, thinking about their businesses. It's a great time to spend, an hour thinking about the questions that we've, identified with respect to AI use cases. I will say, in fairness, it is typically the case for us in our approach that we educate stakeholders first more on AI so that those conversations become productive. But this is a great time to do that. A little bit of education on AI, and then folks have the time to think about their big business questions and the granular things behind those. So with that, I think we're going to, if anyone is still available to stay, we ran long, we apologize, but we're happy to take any questions.
Just a reminder about other topics coming up with the other Take30s with Data Advisor tomorrow and BI Expert on Thursday. But we really appreciate everyone joining and hope to see everyone here next week.
All right. Thank you all.